Yeah.
Do you have a rapier or handle, or like do you have guard? You just use like a curved mouse for that,
For which one?
the rapier guard.
Oh, for this guy?
Yeah.
I would actually probably lay this out with planes. Dang it. Because I'm a little bit of a spaz. So this is the sword from Princess Bride, in case you guys are curious, which I'm totally modeling over the summer. But yeah, I would probably just trace this out with planes. NURBS would be a completely valid way to do it. Just for me personally, like looking at this, like everything is sort of flat. So I'm kind of like, if I laid it out with a plane, I could pretty much just extrude, like, get the overall shape of the thing right, and then just extrude it, and I would instantly have the thickness that I would need. But yeah, and then, I don't know, it seems like the kind of thing where I might do in like a few different pieces or something, but that's mostly just because I don't want to sculpt this whole thing at once, because it would be a nightmare. Yeah. Anywho. Alright, so I'm actually going to make a new Maya scene, because I don't know what I did to my windows there, but it's not good. Alright, so I'm just going to throw in the image from somewhere. Don't know where. Where did I put it? So there's a few things that I usually look for with blades. So first of all, just in terms of setting up my scene, I'm going to actually rotate this so it's at least sort of straight. That made it better. So I usually just again, make it kind of straightish. I'm going to turn off component mode, or component moving, because it's annoying. And just sort of center the blade, but in this case it's super asymmetrical and it really doesn't matter at all. So now that I have that set up, so if you guys ever make blades for my class, or for me for whatever reason, one thing that I usually look at, and it's like my weird biggest pet peeve because I make a lot of blades for like 3D printing and cosplay nonsense, is literally just that I want to see the blade be pointy. Like I want it to look sharp. And this also goes for like kitchen utensils and stuff like that. So my usual workflow for doing some kind of blade like this is, all right, I'm just going to focus on this like gray blade part for now. But usually blades end up having more or less two parts, like what I think of as like the structural part of the blade, where it's like more or less just flat, and then the sharp cutty edge. So pretty much the same thing that I did with the plushie. I'm lazy, I don't like making new workflows. Why is this rotating? God, okay. Anyway, sorry. So I'm basically just going to trace out that first shape with planes. Again, same way I've been doing for the rest of nonsense for the rest of things. So I'm just gonna start out with a little bitty plane, and just kind of keep extruding up, and I'm just tracing along the flat part of this blade. At this point, I'm not paying a whole heck of a lot of attention to my topology or anything. I'm just sort of doing things. So usually, the one thing I guess I will say really quick is usually if I have like some kind of crazy bumped out area like this, that's something where I would usually go through and extrude that out, because this is going to be a lot easier to work with in the end, compared to doing something like, throwing this edge loop right over here and then grabbing this and being like, oh god, this isn't a plane, it's a cube, oh god. Alright, well that's fun. Well that's, oh no, I know what I did, that was stupid. Actually, I don't know what I did, so I'm just going to delete this before I go on with a really broken mesh. But usually it is, so usually it is good practice to not do whatever I just did, but again, if you do have some kind of bump out, just like extrude that out, rather than taking one vertice or like one quad and like stretching it to the high heavens, because that usually will cause some kind of issue in the long run with pulling, or it's honestly just kind of like weird to look at. When you're looking at your models, you want to be able to see like a nice, reasonable like pattern to your geometry, if that makes sense. So like in this case, it's like fairly regular. I kind of just have a line of quads going up the side of the sword. So as I get to the top, I'm just going to shrink these down, and eventually I will just terminate them in a point. So I'm just going to merge that to center. So you can see right now we just, again, sort of have like this weird little piece of geometry that's just sort of tracing this bit of sword. And my workflow for this is also a little bit kind of weird because I usually just make the thing low poly and then just like make it high poly. And And then by the time that it's done being low poly, I also kind of UV it and do the rest of that if I'm going to do that. Because it just sort of makes life a little bit easier in the end. I would always, just for the record, a lot of times I will UV my objects before I add in extra edge loops to smooth them, just because it's less edge loops to deal with when you're cutting your object up, and unless you're doing a lot of like really weird stuff like appending things and merging things or whatever, just adding extra edge loops is not going to affect your UVs, so you could totally cut this up when it is a really low poly object. But anywho, so this is like more or less, it looks like this is actually pretty much more or less the shape of this blade. So I'm just going to grab this and be like, waha, solid decisions. Cool. I'm just going to kind of like shift this over a little bit just because I don't like geometry being squished on top of each other. I think it's awkward. Oh, what is this thing? That's horrible. Alright, so right now basically what I have is this like very awkward little flat plane. And there are two tries in this. So there's one at the very tip and one right here. Game mesh, totally fine. It's going to make it a little bit awkward when I have to go in and add edge loops to smooth it. But it's not going to be, you know, so horrible that it makes the thing impossible to work with. So at this point, once I have the sort of flat part, like the body of the blade blocked out, usually what I'll go back in and do is add the pointy bit, to use the technical term. So I'm just going to grab pretty much all of the faces on this side of the model, where the blade part is, and if I said faces, I meant edges. I'm going to grab all the edges on this side of the model where the blade is, and just extrude them, and pull them out. And in this case, the blade shape itself is fairly regular in the sense that like it doesn't have a lot of, you know, crazy tapering. So it looks like that pretty much follows the actual shape of the blade pretty faithfully. Might like tweak this in a little bit. The only thing's like right down here, you'll notice that it tapers in pretty aggressively. So I'm just going to grab those little edges and just sort of smoosh them back into place along the orthographic. Same thing up here, except in this case, I'm actually just going to take this, this vert and just delete it. And now I have another try at the top, but a try that is doing good things to define the shape of this blade. So at this point, again, we pretty much just have like this weird flat thing. I'm just going to run through and select all of my original faces. So again, pretty much anything that was part of that original like flat piece of the body of the blade. And if you have more orthographics, you'd line these up, but I'm basically just going to pull these out ever so slightly, and you can see that it's making, you know, now I have like a tiny bit of edge to this blade. I find the hardest part, like whenever I'm making props for cosplay and stuff, it's always like the biggest indecision of like how the heck, like how thick do I want to make this? It's like one of my biggest pet peeves. Alright, I'm gonna throw a blend on this really quick because it'll make it a little bit easier to see that edge. Delete history of my object because I can. Alright, so here's my object, and you can see there's like kind of maybe a little bit of an edge. So at this point, what I also probably should have done is flattened the back of this. I'm just sort of assuming there's no blade on this part. It doesn't particularly look sharp to me. So I'm just going to grab that little edge there and extrude that, push it back this way. And I'm actually going to vert snap it, so press and hold V as I move this, to snap it to the same height as the other part of my sword. So this thing is like pretty darn thin. But basically this is what I've left with at this point. And I should be able to go through and, obviously this is only one part of the blade, I'm going to do the same thing I've been doing all class and just like duplicate it, scale it, and then merge them back together so I have like an actual real person blade. So any questions on anything I've done so far? Alright. Alright, yeah, cool. So, again, scale at -1, freeze the scale. Alright, and do a mesh display reverse. So now I have two parts of this blade. You will notice there's like a weird little hole at the top of it. And I found that the other thing that I always find hard to resolve if I don't have like multiple images of the blade is deciding how the end of, like how the top of this works. Because sometimes it looks like the blade, like in this case, I think it probably makes sense to just like shrink all of these parts together and just like make the whole thing pointy. Some blades still look like they sort of have blade coming up here, but it'll be like really thick, and I'm like, how is this? I don't know. You'll find a blade one day that you're modeling, and you're like, this doesn't seem physically possible. But it's just like one of those weird areas of the blade where like sometimes it becomes confusing, and you just sort of like need to make a decision about the shape of the thing at that point. So anyway, I'm just going to grab these two pieces, and again do a mesh combine, and then just do a merge, so that now if I smooth this, I have one giant wiggly blade with a few holes in it, but we'll ignore the holes for now. So again, for the top of this blade, I feel like it does kind of make sense just go through and be like, all right, these guys feel like this blade is like thin enough where it feels reasonable to just sort of shrink the entire portion of this blade and just kind of be like, all right, the whole thing gets pointier at the end. Boom. And it is indeed pointy. It does look very sharp and dangerous. So at this point, this is what I would call pretty much a decent looking low poly blade. You know, it has enough loops to define the curve, but like not so many that you're gonna destroy your entire game engine. If I really wanted to, I could cut more out of here. Just don't care enough. That's also the point where I'd usually go through and actually UV the thing. Because again, it's going to be a lot easier if you want to do like an automatic map or whatever on this. It's easier to do it now when you have fewer edge loops to mess with. Especially because when I convert this to high poly, edge flow up here is going to get real weird real quick. So any questions on this before I swap this to being high poly? Alright. I'm going to turn off my image plane because it's kind of bothering me. I'm also going to... So in case you guys weren't aware, Alt and B will toggle the background color in Maya. I just prefer the blue. I don't know why. But in case it ever switches to like black or something, you're like, this is horrible to look at. Anywho. But yeah, so converting this to high poly. So first thing I usually go through and do, again, I like seeing pointy blades. I'm going to go through and I'm going to make the blade pointy. So I'm just going to insert an edge loop tool, and I will turn on symmetry for my x-axis. Nope. For my z-axis. All right, there we go. I usually just sort of randomly choose axes until it does what I want. So again, I'm just like grabbing this and just sort of adding loops to define that like hard crease on the very tip of the blade and then on the side of the blade. So once we have that, you can see that it, has like a nice sharp looking edge on it. Whole thing's kind of curvy, kind of whatever. So you'll notice like not theoretically, but you will notice like up here, things get a little weird, and that's because I turn these into tries. So if you know you're making something to be high poly in the end, sometimes it's good to just sort of figure out a way to orient your quads so that you don't need to deal with tries up here, because again, it does make life a little difficult. In this case, I'm just going to go back in and just sort of manually trace in some of the geometry by hand. So like I still want this blade tip up here to be kind of pointy. You can see it like sharp edge, and then like loses that sharp edge a little bit because there's no loop running here. So in this case, I'm just going to see what happens if I multi-cut in to, I don't know, I'm just going to see what happens if I sort of cut it up to here and then cut it across the back of the object. All right. So I think I mentioned this before. If you guys are ever like zooming in like this and you find the camera is just sort of cutting off half of your model and you're like, this is no good, select whatever camera you're working with. In this case, I'm in perspective mode. Go into your attribute editor and edit the near clip plane. Set it to be something like a lower value. So as soon as I do that, you have to get closer to your model before it starts cutting out pieces of it. Which again, if you're working on tiny stuff, is very good to know that exists. So again, just click on your camera, attribute editor, near clip plane, it'll fix that issue. So we're going to see what happens if I can go through and if it'll actually let me multi-cut this time. And I'll just cut this up to maybe somewhere like this. All right, multi-cut tool is being trashed right now. Indecision. Well, you let me draw one line. I would settle for a single line. Okay, you suck, multi-cut. All right. Try a different thing. I'm just going to see what happens if I multi-cut click outside my object, hold shift, and drag across, and you can see that it's basically cut a solid line into my object. And at this point, hopefully, it lets me actually cut back up into here. Okay. Great. Yeah, multi-cuts. Usually, honestly, I don't have this many issues with it, but so normally I would just go through and again, just sort of multi-cut a line up, because I do want to continue that little edge loop up there. In this case, I'm just going to see what happens if I very aggressively delete part of my sword, because multi-cut's being stupid. And I'm just going to re-extrude it up and reattach it back into my blade. Just grab those little open bits of the sword, drag them up, kind of line them up somewhere-ish with the original model. Do that again. And these ones I'm just going to merge to center. Ah, hello. And then snap that back into my original mesh. I do seem to have some like weird floating polygons sort of around. Like I said, if you're ever going to like convert this, what am I doing right now? Sorry. If you're shooting to convert things to high poly, I do recommend, if at all possible, to just leave some quads in there, because they will make your life easier. And that's like the one time I say quads will make your life easier. All right, there we go. All right, so I'm just going to merge those to center. And now I have the shape is off, but it's at least a single sword again. Something weird. Oh yeah, because I have holes in my mesh. Duh. All right. So smoothing this, and I'm like, things are kind of weird here. Like why? And then I'm like, oh yeah, because I still have giant gaping holes in my model. So I'm just gonna go ahead and merge those to center, close those off, and it's done a weird thing where symmetry has decided to attach them together in the center. All right. So I'm going to turn off symmetry, and I'm going to merge each side individually, and then turn symmetry back on. Is it on Z, I think? Or X? Z. All right. So now, after apparently much trial and tribulation, we have a blade that pretty much stays pointy to the top of the blade, save this weird area that I've sort of mangled up here. Incidentally, I would hazard a guess that this is, you'll notice like, this is totally not smoothing nicely, and I would imagine that's happening at this point because there is like a giant star here, with, it looks like six edges coming together, meeting at once, and it's also on a really sharp point, somewhere that's stretching a lot when you smooth it, so that's really exacerbating that issue. I could totally fix that, but probably involves multi-cut tool, which is probably not going to work again, unless it does. If it does, I'll be a little... Oh, now you work. Okay. I love multi-cut tool when it doesn't break randomly. Anywho. So I can just delete that line if I wanted to, and it'll still be kind of rounded, but at least it's all quads now, and it's like a little bit less gross looking. And I'll basically just continue doing that, where I would just, go through and find anywhere where there's like weird layers of quads. So in this case, like this loop here sort of cut out, so I would see if I could multi-cut this up and just like terminate this kind of wherever makes sense to the blade. Where exactly that is largely up to your discretion and the actual shape of the blade itself, and whether or not multi-cut actually works at any given point. But yeah, so like honestly that's like more or less how I make most of the blades I make, or at least like how I start. By far the worst part about making any kind of blade is figuring out, in my opinion, like how to smooth that stupid little tip. And then like for stuff like this where it's like a little bit pointed down there, pretty much the standard thing, just go through and be like boop, and then you have a nice little hard point in the curve of that. You can also go down and look at, so like this area down here I kind of forgot about, which I totally could have appended together at some point. So I'm just going to go and kind of grab these loops. Again, I should have done this before I closed it, but I didn't, so I'm just going to grab them and squish them down to the bottom of my mesh, and just sort of close off my blade, because it'll look a little less funky, obviously, that way. Alright, so now I have like a functional bottom on this blade. And then again, like, so the blade pretty much stops being sharp and pointy where it like joins back up into the mesh, so a lot of times what I'll do here is pretty much just kind of go into my top view and more or less sort of just drag that down and make it look like it's flush. And at that point, like you should have relatively decent looking lines in the overall blade. If you wanted to, you could go through, you could go through and like terminate some edge loops in here. I'm getting like a little bit of weird creasing. You could also just sort of, if you wanted this to be perfectly flat, just grab these faces here and go into your, again, another reason I love component mode, but turn on component mode in your scale settings and just be like, bwaha, you are flat now. And just scale it along this axis until it's completely flat. And that should get rid of most of the weird sort of stretching issues in there. Sometimes symmetry makes this a little weird. So, like you'll notice, once I turned symmetry off, the handle started behaving differently. So if you just sort of, work on crushing all of that down, it'll end up making nice sort of hard edges for your stuff. So maybe like throw a loop in there. But yeah, that's like honestly, again, mostly how I just sort of go in and model blades. So any questions on anything I've done for this so far? All right. In terms of the rest of the blade, honestly, I would make this pretty much the same way I've been making most of the other things in class today. So like for this black part here, I would just make that as pretty much another plane. Treat this little bevel here as effectively another blade. And if this is a game mesh, or like something I'm 3D printing, honestly even an animation object sometimes, I would probably just extrude it and clip it directly through my blade. For punching the holes in, I mean, I would pretty much do those like more or less the same that I do the rest of the holes and things. Anyone want how to punch a hole demo? All right. Honestly, and here's my thing. If it's a game mesh, or any mesh that you're not smoothing, I would shamelessly Boolean this hole in. Shamelessly. Maybe with a little shame. But, like, honestly, this would be like the easiest shape to make ever with a Boolean. To be like, boom, grab these faces, and just extrude them, and then maybe extrude them a little more and just sort of shape them slightly. But like that's pretty much the whole shape. At which point, again, I would probably just Boolean that out of my mesh. If you're doing like a game mesh, by the time you finish with it, the whole thing is being triangulated anyway. So the fact that you would have to go in and sort of triangulate the edge of that is like not something that's really going to affect the mesh in the long run, in my opinion. Don't get me wrong, this would be like the last thing I do to this because Booleans make it super hard to work on your model. But I don't hate Booleans just because they're Booleans. They have their place in my heart. I seem to have done a weird thing and made this plane. All right. So now that I have my cylinder, I'm just going to extrude that, punch it all the way through my hole, and then pretty much just again grab my sword, grab my mesh, go mesh Booleans difference. Ahaha! Now I have a hole in my sword. You know what else I have? Like 80 bajillion N-gons everywhere. But again, if this is a game mesh, you can just sort of go and do mesh cleanup on it. So again, just mesh cleanup. And you want to do cleanup matching polygons that'll actually fix the N-gons. And then do faces with more than 4 sides. And it'll go through and tessellate your mesh. Is this super pretty? No. Are there N-gons in it? Also no. Does it smooth well? God no. But do you now have a hole in your thing that's going to be tessellated anyway if this is low poly? Yeah, you do. So again, with game meshes, if you want to Boolean stuff, you can. Just make sure that at a minimum you clean up the N-gons. If you were feeling fancy, you could also go through and like, sometimes it'll like this line here is like stretched pretty badly, so you can just sort of get rid of that. It'll leave a little quad in here. Kind of doesn't super matter. I wouldn't recommend this for doing like a smooth model. I would actually go through and like manually draw on the topology, but again, if you need a quick hole in like a game mesh or something you're doing for 3D printing, bullying the crap out of everything. That's not the message I wanted you guys to take away from this, but that's apparently where we've gone. But yeah, so I don't know. Any questions on that? Yeah.
So if you're submitting like the weapon extra credit as a low poly model and
Yep.
rendering within a game engine for it,
Yep.
is it okay if there are endgons if it doesn't affect the overall model itself?
Endgons are always evil. I would fix endgons. Just like probably game engines wouldn't explode. If it's on anything like moving or animated, or like things being deformed, I would totally get rid of the endgons. If it's on a static mesh, again, game engines are probably going to handle it fine. For 3D printing in particular, sometimes it gets weird if it's like a really weird shaped endgon. But yeah, I would still get rid of the endgon shapes, because endgons are gross. Especially if they're really large and we're in a position that's like on the front of your model kind of thing. But yeah. Any other questions? All right. Okay, hopefully the audio exists again. That was really weird. I like cut it out with my foot, but it was still getting feed from somewhere, which is bizarre. But anyway, but yeah, so like the rest of this blade, again, I would make it more or less the same way. Black thing, pretty much just like another blade on the existing blade. Even these little pieces down here, I mean, they kind of just look like overlapping pieces of metal. I would honestly probably just start with a plane and then extrude them to whatever thickness I needed them, and then just kind of like shift the edges around a little bit. I also have another, so just like as a more complete example, back to Sketchfab. I can't spell Sketchfab. Fab. Okay. So this is actually a model that I was commissioned to do a while ago, which I made literally in the exact same way that I just showed you guys. Give it a sec. All right. So like again, I pretty much just started like this gray part. I just outlined it with a giant plane, extruded, shaped my blades, and then even like all of these little squiggles down here, I just started with a flat plane, outlined the shape on the orthographics, and then you can see I kind of went in and like wove them into each other a little bit. That's even something that I did before I extruded them. So I just like had a little plane and pretty much just like imagine weaving little pieces of paper together. That's basically what I did for this whole design. And then I just clipped them very shamelessly into the inside of my model. And then for even like this stuff here, I still just did with a plane. So like these squiggles, I pretty much just, again, just drew out the overall outline of the squiggle, threw an edge loop right down the center, and then I just drag that edge loop straight up, and it pretty much makes you a very nice little pyramid. So yeah, but I mean, this is like, I guess kind of a more complex example of more or less like what I just showed you. So again, if you guys are ever submitting blades to me for stuff, things that I look at specifically because I've modeled blades before, is it pointy? If you want to make it like blunted or whatever, because it's like old and rusty, like that's one thing, but if it's just like a cube, it's a little awkward looking. But yeah, so is it pointy? And then how have you resolved the areas like, usually it'll be, you know, at the tip of the blade, particularly if you have like a large flat area. I was doing, I lost it. I was doing the Buster Sword the other day, and it was like a really, for section 1, if you guys want to go back and like watch it, but it was like a really weird way to sort of like try to figure out how to resolve it, because it looks like one side is like super thick and flat, but then you have a blade sort of going perfectly into the top, at which point it doesn't become flat. Nice. I see. That's quite funny. But yeah, so again, that's like usually like the tip of the blade, depending on how it's situated, is like another thing that I would look at, just like partly out of curiosity to see like how you handled it and like how the topology is. Do things maintain their smoothing at the top of the blade? Which is honestly usually the part that I end up fighting with the most, just because I throw in tries and then regret it later. But that's pretty much my shtick on blades. So does anybody have any questions about anything I did here, or like any other particular models or whatever that they are thinking of making for their final or similar, that they want to look at? All right. In that